I spent 20 years outside the United States, and I had covered as a foreign correspondent totalitarian cultures, everything from the East German Stasi state to Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia. So I know how totalitarian systems work. I know the kind of dark emotions they evoke. I know the mechanisms they use to shut down dissent. And when I came back, it was utterly apparent that the country had gone collectively insane in a very frightening way. Not only their misunderstanding of the wider world, something as a foreign correspondent I was very cognizant of, but their misunderstanding of who they were and where they were going.
Gaddafi has lost the legitimacy to govern, and it is time for him to go without further violence or delay. The United States has imposed additional sanctions of our own, and today I discussed with our European allies the specific measures that they will pursue to keep increasing the pressure and further isolating Gaddafi and his regime.
I know it's hard to keep track of them all, but do you remember the war in Libya?
The situation there was very unpredictable and escalated very rapidly. The anti-Gaddafi fighters on the ground were often very untrained and inexperienced. There was a very strict control measure put on media coverage of any sort, and reaching the front lines in Libya was often extremely hazardous as well.
As for Libya itself, today that war-torn country remains in chaos as a direct result of the NATO intervention, with a divided central government, armed militias including ISIS vying for power in most major cities, and refugees fleeing to Europe by the boatload from Libya's shores, many of them drowning in the process.
In recent days, there have been allegations that NATO actions may have led to civilian casualties. Since the start of this mission, we have conducted over 5,000 strike sorties. I deeply regret any loss of life in this conflict.
Most people have no concept of how fragile their environment is. I think you have to, as I have done, live in societies that collapse to realize how quickly they go down and how fragile they are. And so there's a kind of emotional incapacity to understand collapse, even when it's facing you.
When you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order.
We came, we saw, he died.
Can you talk about Libya? Because that's something that I think most Americans really, with Iraq, there were American boots on the ground. A lot of Americans aren't aware at all of what happened in Libya and what the role of NATO was and the United States.
In 2011, what was done to Libya is a crime, a crime of the greatest magnitude. Yes, there were protests that broke out in Benghazi and others. In fact, I have friends who went out and protest, lawyers, human rights people, and so on. In 2011, there was no evidence in February 2011 that there was going to be a massacre or anything like that. The battalion, the army in Benghazi, in the eastern sector of Libya, defected to the rebels. It was basically a civil war, actually.
عربية بالكامل تقتل تشنق في مشانق مع انتظار لماذا؟ وممكن الدور جاي عليكم كلكم. ليش أمريكا قاتلت مع صدام حسين ضد الخميني؟ كان صديقها. تشيني كان صديق لصدام حسين. رامز فندي كان وزير دفاع الامريكي لما كان يدمر في العراق، صديق حبيب لصدام حسين، واخيرا باعوه شنقوه. حتى انتم اصدقاء امريكا، نحن اصدقاء امريكا، بلاش نقول نحن اصدقاء امريكا، قلنا قد توافق امريكا على شنقنا في يوم ما.
Tango approaching. Contact front. RPG. Incoming! Oh shit! Go, get him! Get cover! Get cover! Move right! Move right! Move right! Move right! Let it speed!
The Libyan leader, bloodied and beaten, dragged alive through the streets after being caught in a drain. The irony of his hiding place not lost on those Gaddafi described as rats from rising up against him. This gold-plated gun apparently taken from the deposed despot moments before he was killed.
We kitchen there, and we shot him. Somebody shot him by gun, 9 milli.
These final images of a man who ruled for 42 years, a far cry from how the world used to see Gaddafi, the one-time handsome hero leading Libya to a bright new future, the eccentric dictator who fell from international grace, welcomed back into the fold, and then firmly booted out again.
I saw how lonely acts of defiance to totalitarian regimes, which at the moment were considered futile, kept alive another narrative, ironic points of light. That's what acts of conscience, acts of rebellion do. It appears often at the moment that it's meaningless, but when you stand up to decayed systems of power, systems of evil, and you speak a truth, even people within those systems hear your voice. And that's why the state is pushing through one draconian law after another, whether it's the wholesale spying and eavesdropping, monitoring, and photographing of every American citizen, whether it's the use of the Espionage Act to shut down whistleblowers, whether it's the National Defense Authorization Acts and Section 1021, for which I sued the president in federal court and won, which permits the U.S. military to seize U.S. citizens and hold them indefinitely without due process in military facilities. They're all doing this for a reason. They know what's coming. And I've covered uprisings all over the world. You know when the tinder is there. You never know what's going to trigger it. You never know when it's going to come. You never know how it's going to express itself, but you know it's there, and it's definitely here. The corporate state knows no limits at this point. It has no regulation, it has no government control, it writes its own laws, it writes its own legislation. So that the rise of popular culture and the obliteration of real culture is part of this entire corporate totalitarian assault on beauty and truth.